Okay, so we're back. Remember from the last video, we said that the law of supply shows us that when prices increase, the quantity supplied also increases. And the law of supply, or the supply curve, which is really just showing us the law of supply graphically, tells us that firms would want to produce more when the price is higher because they would make more profit. Remember, we assume that costs stay the same. Of course, they can't always charge a higher price because a market has two sides, and we're just looking at how suppliers would behave, but we're not taking into consideration demand yet. So the supply curve really just shows us, like the demand curve, it shows us the ability and willingness of firms to produce at each price. Okay, it's hypothetical. It's showing us the hypothetical relationship between price and quantity. It's only hypothetical when we just look at supply by itself. All we're saying is if we surveyed a whole bunch of businesses and we asked them at each price how much would they like to supply of their product, they would want to supply more at a high price and less at a low price. Not that complicated, yet. So also remember, it's a line, it's a linear relationship. I'm going to call it the supply curve. You'll look at why it's a supply curve at university. So let's look at this graphically. So you can see here that we have a upward sloping curve from left to right. We have an upward sloping curve. You can also see that as prices rise here on the y-axis, quantity supplied also increases, which shows that there is a positive relationship between price and quantity. And the other important thing is that we need to understand the language here. So remember that just like when we looked at demand, there are specific language that we need to use to explain what happens. So a movement along the curve firstly, caused by a change in price. So in this case, we're looking at a contraction up here, okay? So if there's a decrease in the price for this particular good, there'll be a decrease in the quantity supplied of this particular good, and that will cause a movement along the curve like this, or a contraction, okay? Now remember, the same rules apply. Whenever there is a movement along either the supply or the demand curve, we always, to the left, we always call that a contraction. So that is a contraction along the supply curve. And if I drew a demand curve, that is also a contraction. So any movement along a curve to the left, we call a contraction. Now, if we look at an expansion, again, this is just a price changing. So price in this case is increased, quantity supplied is increased, and we call that an expansion along the supply curve. An expansion along the supply curve. It's an expansion because it's a movement along the curve to the right. And again, same rule, if I had a demand curve here and it was a movement along the curve to the right, that's also an expansion. Keep that in mind. So the next thing we need to do is understand a shift in the demand curve. Now, we're really looking at the same things as we did when we looked at demand. There is going to be a change in the hypothetical relationship between price and quantity, okay? In this case, you can see there's been an increase in supply, or a shift to the right, and all that means is that there is an increase in quantity supplied at each price. So if we looked at every single price along the curve, we would say that there is quantity supplied has increased at that price, okay? And we don't know why yet, but there's been an increase in quantity supplied at each price, or a shift to the right. Now, if we look at the other side, it's going to be the opposite. If there's a shift to the left, we call that a decrease. And that's because it shows a decrease in quantity supplied at each price. So if I looked at each price and I said, how much quantity would you like to supply, and surveyed businesses, after some change like this, there is going to be a decrease at each price in the quantity supplied. Shift to the left. Now, just a little bit of an extension for you here. If we drew in a demand curve, just to throw a little bit of extension, the reason we need to know the difference between a movement and a shift, movement along the curve, is because demand and supply together, supply is shifted to the left, and there will be a contraction along the demand curve. Two very different things, but you need to be able to explain them clearly and concisely and with the correct language. All right, that's the supply curve. In the next video, we'll look at what causes a shift in the supply curve. Bye for now.